Our next speaker is going to combine the science with the policy and will focus on Europe. Peringe Grennfelt is our next speaker, and he's a senior advisor to the Swedish Environmental Research Institute. Peringe.
Well, thank you, and dear Henning and dear audience here. I see many friends here, yeah, that's okay. Now it's working. Fine. So I will, in my talk, I will concentrate on the European perspective and talk a lot about the European pollution. I will give a little of a historical review and also talk about how science and policy has interacted over time. I also give some, say something about, well, what you can call the success story about sulfur, and also look a little bit into the future. Well, my starting point will be the UN conference in 1972. Before this conference, a small booklet of less than 100 pages was prepared on the sulfur and acidification problem. And this small booklet, I would say, is together with the article by Svante Odén in 1968, the most important input of scientific input, since it drove the policy much more than I think anyone has expected. And I'll come back to that. Well, I just jump over this since that has Henning already mentioned. But this booklet, it is a complete integrated assessment. It's not only covers the problem, but it also presents a methodology that has been used all over time, again and again, for different environmental problems. It contains the emissions, it contains the distribution of air pollution or whatever it is. It discusses the health effects when you talk about sulfur and acidification. It discusses the corrosion effects, the effects on lakes and streams, the effects on forests. And more important, it discusses the costs of air pollution and cost of abatement, and it looks also into the different abatement options, and it closes the circle. And this is a very important piece of work. But, well, I'll come back to that. The sulfur problem started much earlier. We can, in Europe, go back to the 13th century, and where the burning of coal caused large problems in particular in the United Kingdom, and where also the first measures were proposed already in the 13th century. But more important is probably also the work that was done during the 17th century. In the mid of that century, air pollution was high on the agenda due to and the problem of coal burning and the health effects and different effects. And that was within the Royal Society, especially by a scientist whose name was John Evelyn. He pointed to the air pollution problem. He also mentioned, I think for the first time, sulfur as a compound of importance. And that was in connection with the damages to statues and buildings. Well, since then, air pollution almost became forgotten. Well, not really, but the artists found the light, the London light, very interesting. A lot of painters really used the fog light and the smog light and painted in their paintings. And this is Claude Monet, who has painted. There are a lot of paintings from Claude Monet on just the London smog from the turn of the at the end of the 19th century. Well, my talk will now go through stepwise the air pollution history and see how science and policy has developed. I will start with the 70s and the important parts here. And the driving force during the 70s was like lake acidification. The extinction of fish and also the explanation that this acidification was caused by sulfur, and the low pHs were caused by sulfur deposition. That was very important. And also the explanation of toxicity to fish and so on. So that was a driving force, especially from the Scandinavian country. But this was an issue for the Scandinavian countries and not for the rest of Europe in large. The other problem that was important was the part of science that was important was the transboundary transport. And that, of course, was, if we, as we observed in Scandinavia, saw a long-range transport, we wanted also to blame someone, to get someone to take action. And here I think the Henning did a very important work. He did a very important work when he, through his modeling, showed the importance of transport. He made also the first budget, sulfur budget for Northern Europe, and I think this has been very important. There were also the number of projects showing this long-range transport, especially the OECD project. And that was also the starting point for the long-term monitoring, the EMAP monitoring network, which started in 1977. And the importance of that network has been really large. So, but at the end of the 70s, we entered a new phase, which we can call the phase of consensus, where we started to do policy across common policies within Europe, and this and in particular the formation of the convention in 1979. And the starting point for this convention is, in fact, this report. Since based on this report, there was a sentence in the conclusion from the UN conference 1972 that acid rain is a problem. And then during negotiations between the East and West on security issues, environmental problems were brought up. And from the side of Soviet Union, they said, this is a problem that we can collaborate on. The Western world thought that this is just propaganda. But after some time, the Soviet Union convinced the rest of Europe, and that formed the basis for this UNEC Convention on Long-Range Transport of Air Pollution. And under that convention, the executive body, there were two bodies formed. One was the EMAP for monitoring and modeling the atmospheric part, and one that's working on the effects part. So we already from the beginning, effects were included in the policy work. There was a lot of resistance from the rest of Europe, even if the convention was there. No one was really interested in taking action until there came an alarm on Waldsterben on forest death in Germany. That came in 1988, and it turned the interest totally in Europe. And suddenly, Germany started to take their actions, and during the 80s, something like 80% of the emissions were reduced within Germany. And this was done, I would say, also, even if I'll say the scientific basis was quite weak, Germany took the actions. And it also formed the basis for this first protocol on reduction of emissions under the convention, 30% reduction. Then I'll turn over to the next phase, what we call the late 80s and early 90s. well, we had a situation where we looked at percentage, but we think, well, there was also a discussion, we could be smarter. We want to include cost effectiveness and also relations to effects. And what was important here was that we came to the issue of critical loads was introduced, and to get something better than percentage reduction. And the critical loads here, was developed during the 80s, and in particular there was a workshop in Skokloster in 1988 where scientists and policymakers met together and said, this is a concept that we can work on from both sides, from the scientific side and from the policy side. It will work on both sides. And then, of course, it became important to operationalize the concept. And that was done quite quickly in the first map of the exceedance of critical loads for acidification, essentially sulfur, for Europe was developed in 1990. And that formed the basis for the second sulfur protocol, where this map of critical loads and the exceedance of critical loads was put together with the source receptor matrices, and also then it was used as a basis to close a gap between present load and the critical loads at a certain percentage, and also used cost effectiveness when priorities were given. And then each country, each nation got its own ceiling by 2010. And it resulted in about a 60% reduction of sulfur emissions compared to 90 by 2010. I'll come back to the result of that. Well, after sulfur, we should turn to nitrogen oxides. And then, of course, nitrogen oxides, we didn't have one problem. It turned out to be eutrophication, it turned out to be acidification, formation of ozone, and so on. Finally, and eutrophication was not caused only by nitrogen oxide, but also by ammonia, and so on. So we got into a complicated problem. And that resulted also that we could develop a sort of a multi-pollutant, multi-effect approach. And this was, well, the way we presented it for the policymakers. And going through the different steps here and saying, we have the scientific understanding of most of the steps here. And we can put everything together in a common model and optimize that. It's the same way as we did for the sulfur protocol. And we did so, and it resulted in the Gothenburg protocol in 1999, where we could put forward natural ceilings, not only for sulfur or nitrogen oxides, but also for ammonia and volatile organic compounds. So it could be related to acidification, eutrophication, ozone, vegetation effects from ozone, and health effects from ozone. And I think that was a very large step forward when this was accepted under the convention. European Union also started at the same time, and they also adopted what they call the Natural Emissions Ceilings Directive in 2001, which is very similar to in its construction to the Gothenburg Protocol. And the outcome of the Gothenburg Protocol, which had a base year from 1990 to 2010, we can see was very good. And this is for the acidification, the exceedance of critical loads for acidification in Europe for 1990 and 2010. And of course, with the reductions between 70 and 80% of the sulfur emissions, the result became very visible, and we can see the success of the actions. Now I'll turn to the more recent situation and today's situations. And well, Europe after 2000, and now we are going from protection of ecosystem to protection of health. It was realized about around the year 2000 that, well, health effects was very important, and we had several hundred thousands of premature deaths in Europe due to air pollution, in particular particles, as Henning mentioned earlier. And so the interest, but very little happened, I would say. There was an attempt to revise this national emission ceilings directive, but it failed. Instead, there were some regulations on cars and trucks and stationary sources, but not taking a very large step forward. And well, ecosystems effect was put further down on the agenda this time. Well, before talking a little about the future, I just wanted to mention a couple of two scientific issues and one policy issue that have been very much discussed over the, well, now when we see the outcome of or see the emission reductions and the outcome. One is the issue of linearity. Well, will the deposition decrease in the same in proportion to the emission reductions and recovery? Will ecosystems recover to the status they had before? And finally, has policy worked? Has the air pollution control really been effective in terms of emission reduction? Which other policy may have been important? Well, this is showing what we can call the red bars here. They are showing the total deposition, and the blue bars are showing the wet deposition. You can see at the it's going from the about 1990 now to 2014, and you can see that in the beginning, the total deposition, this wet and dry deposition, the total deposition consisted to about 50% of dry deposition. But going to the end of this period, the dry deposition has almost disappeared. It's mainly wet deposition when we looked at forested catchments on the Swedish west coast. So this here we can see that we have a non-linearity. And recently, David Fowler from UK presented a graph where he had plotted the emission reductions against the total deposition in the UK against the emissions, the total emissions. And what you can see that in the beginning, when they started to reduce emissions, the deposition decreased faster than the emission reductions. Then it decreased slower, and finally it seems to be more proportional at the end. And this illustrates that we have non-linearities in the system that we have to look at. But for Europe as a whole, it doesn't matter, since about 90% of the emissions within Europe will be deposited within what you can call a European domain. When it comes to recovery, well, what you can see here is that fish has begun to run again in the Norwegian streams. But we can also use models now to see what will happen in the future. And what you can see here from the bottom figure is that recovery will take time, but it also, you can see that highly sensitive sites will not recover, even if you look at this in the long term. The third one issue was the political issue, a more political issue. And that is, if you look at the emissions, and look at the coupling of emissions from the GDP growth, which is the red dotted line here, you can see that the emissions of sulfur have been decoupled, and you can also see the very large reductions. But if you look at the reasons for emission reduction, you can see that there are three main reasons for emission reductions. And with share about 1/3 each. You can say that 1/3 is caused by energy policies. 1/3 is caused by switch of fuel, well, going from coal to gas and going from or to renewables. And the 1/3 is what you can call air pollution policy, installations of end-of-pipe technologies. Well, the interesting, going back to the small report from 1992. Yep. Henning had, in that there was also a scenario, 3 scenarios. One which was this business as usual scenario with increased emissions. One was just a flat stabilizing the emissions, and one is decreasing the emissions. And you can see how the emissions developed over time here, and it is very clear that even the best scenario for the future we have reached much further than the best scenario. I would say that it's very interesting to see how you and others in 1971 really looked at this in, I think, a very reasonable way. But air pollution is still a large problem, and this is in Europe. This is a photo from Paris in March this year. What we can see now is that the sulfur emissions will continue to decrease. The Gothenburg Protocol has been revised, and the red lines here, you can see that is what should be achieved by 2020. And you can also see that we are very close to reach that already in 2010. So the politicians were not very eager to produce much more than what they already have done. Well, looking forward, we have still health effects from air pollution. We have still effects from acidification. This is a picture from Switzerland, showing that we still have a lot of exceedances of the critical loads, but now it's nitrogen, essentially. We can see that biodiversity is still at risk in many countries. Ozone is causing 10 to 15% less production of crops and forest. And therefore, the European Union has proposed an emission target for 2030. And you can see, if you look for sulfur, the proposal is that the emissions should be reduced by 80% based on the situation in 2005. We are, of course, on our way there, but that means that the emissions will be down to just a couple of million tons compared to the situation in 1980, when we were maybe at the order of 50 million tons. So we will come down by 95%. We can also see that there is a lot of benefit in linking air pollution policies to climate. And I'll not go into further details of this since I have no time, but we haven't so far looked into the possibility of what all the benefit of climate policy. So that will be even a co-benefit here when we look into reduction of air pollution problems. I go over that and come to a conclusion. So sulfur and acid rain has been the main focus when the convention was formed in 1979. But there were also other problems. But sulfur and acid rain was the main driver. It has been solved essentially to a very large extent. Instead, new drivers and new pollutants have come higher up on the agenda. Today, the further reduction of sulfur is entirely driven by the health aspects. And in the Nordic countries or in Scandinavia, we still see benefit in sulfur reduction, since that will reduce the acidification problem, but it's not an argument for the rest of Europe. Yes, I think I'll finish with that and say thank you.
Thank you very much, Peringe. We have time for a couple of questions before we go on. I'm sure there must be some questions out there after that fascinating talk. Well, if not, I might take the option as chair to ask you a question. Just at the end there, you were talking about co-benefits between climate change and air pollution, action on both, whereas Henning was talking about a trade-off, where if you did something about air pollution, you would unmask some of the climate change. Can you explain how the co-benefits works?
Well, the co-benefits, of course, is on the other side. It's on the emission side and the abatement side. Of course, when you reduce, the use of fossil fuels, it also means that you don't have emissions of sulfur dioxide, you don't have emissions of nitrogen oxide. Of course, if you replace that with bioenergy, you still have nitrogen oxide, and you may increase the emissions of soot and particles. So that is, of course, a drawback to some extent that we need to take into account. But there are large co-benefits here that we need to explore, and especially when we're looking at cost, the overall cost of abatement.
Any questions from the audience? Well, I might take one more then. There was a lot of fascinating things about your talk. One of the things early on in the 1980s that I found interesting in the response was it seemed to be mainly a problem in Western Europe, with a lot of the pollution coming from the UK, from England, impacts in Scotland and Scandinavia. And yet you said the Soviet Union played a major role. What was their interest in jumping in? Were they getting some of the pollution all the way across into the Soviet Union?
Well, I think, they did some calculations and some measurements in the beginning of the 70s showing that even still on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain, the emissions in Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, they gave a large impact in the Soviet Union. So I think that is the reason why they became quite interested in the issue. They also have a strong, internal environmental movement at that time. So it was on the agenda within the Soviet government, so to say.